I'm very pleased to introduce our program with Barney Frank, presenting his memoir, Frank, A Life in Politics from the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. Barney Frank, a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, represented the 4th Congressional District of Massachusetts for 16 terms and chaired the House Financial Services Committee from 2007 to 2011. Throughout his political career, Frank became known as an advocate for LGBT rights, affordable housing, and financial reform. In a recent review of Mr. Frank's new book, The Washington Post calls its author, quote, one of the most idiosyncratic, influential, and entertaining people ever to serve in the United States Congress, and also deems him, quote, the early 21st century's answer to Mark Twain. The first lines of his new book sum up his unique perspective brilliantly from the get-go. In 1954, I was a fairly normal 14-year-old, enjoying sports, unhealthy food, and loud music. But even then, I realized that there were 2 ways in which I was different from the other guys. I was attracted to the idea of serving in government, and I was attracted to the other guys. The Boston Globe praises Frank's intertwined political and personal odysseys add up to a remarkable story. Frank has been a groundbreaking figure. We're honored to host its author here in Harvard Square tonight. Please join me in welcoming Barney Frank.
Thank you. Thank you. I am reluctant to spoil it by talking. I very much appreciate you being here, and I want to get right into what's one of several issues that I think I raise and try to deal with. I will not be able to cover everything, so when we get to the open discussion period, and let me say, first of all, often people in audiences are told, please make it a question and not a speech. I never understood that. If you want to make a speech and have me comment on it, that's fine. If you want to make a speech and have me not comment on it, not a problem either. So, but one of the questions I've been asked legitimately is, all right, you talk about 2 great movements. One, the unforeseen enormous drop in prejudice against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. In fact, in some ways, sadly, because we still have this great problem, we started in 1969 having made significant progress in abolishing legally discrimination based on race. And by a few years ago and today, sadly, I think the society has made more progress in diminishing prejudice based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It was symbolized in a week of very mixed emotions for me in 2013 when 2 issues I'd been working on were decided in an opposite way by the Supreme Court. By a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court voted to invalidate the Defense of Marriage Act that ludicrously named assault on the right of people to be happy, but it also threw out the Voting Rights Act. Now, I had been on the floor to try to defeat the Defense of Marriage Act. I'd been on the floor of the House when the Voting Rights Act was reenacted. And that was, it seemed to me, sadly symbolic that we had made greater progress on defeating sexual orientation and gender identity prejudice than race. I think one reason is actually related to how we made the progress on LGBT issues. That was by those of us who were in any of those categories ending the period of hiding. We told people who we were. There was a period when that was somewhat controversial. I can remember in the 80s when I and others were being honest about our sexual orientation. There were well-meaning people who said, well, look, I'm glad you're happy, and of course I think that's not a problem, but why do you have to be public about it? Why do you have to mention it? And I finally pointed out, in fact, gay people do not discuss our sexuality any more frequently than straight people do. The difference is that when gay people affirm our sexuality, it's called coming out. When straight people do it, it's called talking. And very few people go through the day without alluding to their sexuality. But what happened as we came out, two things happened. First of all, we destroyed the stereotype. I mean, it was literally a prejudice based on ignorance. And it was a particular problem, I think, for people. It's very hard to maintain the validity of a prejudice when you do not know against whom you are supposed to attach it. If people were so terrible, how come you didn't know who they were until they told you? The other factor is that straight people found out that they had lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgender relatives and friends and customers and teammates and salespeople and teachers and students and doctors and patients, etc. In particular, people found out they had LGBT relatives. That's one of the missing elements with regard to race. Most white people do not have African American relatives. Some do in the South. They try not to talk about it very much. But that was one of the sort of advantages that we had. And it seems to me that particularly those of us who have benefited from the diminution of prejudice against our sexual orientation ought to feel some special obligation to redouble the effort which is needed to deal with race. But the question I'm asked is, all right, you've seen this great diminution in regard to sexual orientation prejudice, and you have seen this increasing anger towards government and lack of support for government. Do you see a connection? Well, I thought about that, because originally I said I didn't see a connection. But now I do see an important point to make, and it is relevant that there is no connection. By which I mean this. 10 years ago, there was Thomas Frank's very thoughtful book, What's the Matter with Kansas? The general view then was that one of the reasons there was an alienation from liberal Democrats and from the government programs we supported on the part of white working class men, middle class men, was that they were offended by liberal support for gay people and for abortion and disrespect for religion, God, gays, and guns, etc. Now, guns is an issue, and there is no denying that that is one of the areas where some percentage of white men become angry, although I don't think it's overwhelming. But the argument that it was the social issues that drove people to vote against their economic interests is clearly wrong. And the proof of that is that as broad acceptance of the right to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, kind of a strange word, as a disappearance of the prejudice, and it is disappearing very rapidly. I could not have predicted. I mean, 10 years ago, if you had asked me, 12 years ago, if it would be controversial if I married my husband while I was still in Congress, I would have said, yes, it would be very controversial. That turned out to be true, because when we did get married in 2012, given the limitations of space, a number of my colleagues were very angry that I didn't invite them. But the fact is that the progress I've talked about that we all see in LGBT issues has paralleled the drop in respect for government liberalism. In other words, if it was pro-gay stuff that made these people not want to vote Democratic, this wouldn't have worked the way it did. And I was at a dinner meeting in Washington after one election in a few years ago. I mentioned this in the book. One of the union leaders was there, maybe steel workers, maybe mine workers, somebody with significant representation in the Appalachian area. And one of the liberal Democrats said, well, you know, I know guns is the big problem for your voters. The guy exploded. He got too angry. And he said, no, and it's the economic issue. And I now believe that's the case. I think the reason we have seen this anger on the part of white working class men and middle class men, that is, people who work for a living who don't have high educational levels, who do not have specialized technical skills, but who do kind of basic work, some with the hands, some without. Why are they so angry? And I think it is economic, and my analysis is this. He said, it's the economy. What we sometimes do as human beings is to take an exceptional period for the norm. The exceptional period was America really from 1940 through the mid-70s. That was a period when America gained a degree of economic superiority worldwide that was unprecedented. And it happened because we geared up to help arm the rest of the world. And then the rest of the developed world was totally devastated, every single country, by World War II. And we profited from World War II. I don't mean that in a negative way, but we had this physical protection of the oceans, and we became the world's supplier. And in the immediate aftermath of World War II, well into the 70s, America maintained that advantage. So if you were an American who was willing to work, you didn't have to have any particular set of skills. You could go into the auto plant, the steel plant, the rubber plant. You could go into construction and make a very good living. And that was eroding by the 70s. It took a while to realize it. The world was changing economically. The rest of the world was catching up to us. The oil-producing companies were charging us more. They were not subsidizing us the way they were, in fact, until the 70s and the formation of OPEC. And the relative economic position of people in America who did not have high technological or other advanced skills or some form of intellectual property began to diminish. And it's when the relative economic position of this group of Americans eroded. I said, by the way, white working class Americans, because obviously in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, if you were African American or a woman, you did not get the same benefit. There was still sexism, there was racism. In the construction trades, for instance, yeah, if you were a white guy and you were in the construction trades, you did very well. The construction trades until well into that period, after that period, were pretty exclusionary of black people. So as we progressed from the 80s onward, the relative economic position of working class and middle class, white guys in particular, eroded. It wasn't necessarily so great for others, but African Americans were seeing some gains legally. Women were seeing gains legally and economically, not to the point of equality. And here's the problem. The anger, I believe, that a lot of white guys evince towards liberalism is not based on a rejection of government. There are some people who don't like government. A lot of rich people who think if the government gets big, it's going to come after their money. I wish that were true. There are people who are engaged in activities that will be disturbed if there's a strong environmental policy. So there are other people just philosophically opposed to government, followers of Ayn Rand. But I don't think that applies to what we used to call the Reagan Democrats, the kind of people who would have voted for Harry Truman and then certainly Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy. These are people who are angry at government precisely because they believe in it so strongly. That is, they have the experience of government having delivered in bad times. These are people who grew up with Franklin Roosevelt as the role model. And when things got bad, Franklin Roosevelt came to the rescue, and Harry Truman and others tried to do that. And what they now see is that government is not helping and in some ways making it worse. And the problem is that they see the Democrats as the party of government, correctly. It is also the case, and people have said, well, is this some failure of the Democrats? Here's part of the problem. In the 35 years since Ronald Reagan was elected president, there has been a situation where there was a Democratic president, House, and Senate for exactly 4 years. The first 2 years of Bill Clinton and the second 2 years of Obama. We have held ourselves out as trying to fix things. People have expected us to fix things, and we haven't had the power to do it. Frankly, in both of those two periods, we did very well. Bill Clinton made the tax code more progressive than ever before in American history. And there was actually a beginning of a decline in the inequality. Under President Obama, we had health care, which helps reduce inequality, according to the Congressional Budget Office. We had financial reform. We had some other things that helped. But 4 years out of 35 doesn't give you a lot of time to get anything done. And instead, you saw this erosion. Now, part of it, people legitimately blamed the Democrats, and I think we made a great mistake. Well, there were two areas where economists 30 years ago were dismissive of liberal advocacies, and they said, you mean well, but you're wrong. Economists 30 years ago were dismissive of the minimum wage. They said it does more harm than good, on the whole. And they believed very strongly that international trade was a good thing and there was no basis for questioning it. On both counts, economists have reconsidered. You can see this in Paul Krugman's work. You can see this in Alan Kruger, who was at the Council of Economic Advisors. What happened was, in the first place, that we did raise the minimum wage in the 90s, and unemployment went down, not up, because you, in fact, may have attracted some people in there. I mean, the economic evidence is overwhelming that the minimum wage does not cause unemployment. And that's been a change in the economic profession. Similarly, with regard to trade, there is a recognition now that trade does make the country as a whole wealthier, but in ways that exacerbate the inequality within the country. America can sell to the rest of the world the things that highly educated, technically skilled people make. It has to buy from the rest of the world the things that people without great skills and just a willingness to work make, which means that international trade, and Bill Clinton started out being for NAFTA with no real understanding of that. By his last year, he understood that you could not do trade without putting rules in that say, we're not trading with you if you don't have good economic rules and good environmental rules. I think we've gone beyond that now. But the problem was that there were these policies that, if anything, exacerbated the natural workings of the economics. The feelings about race and gay people and women on the part of whites, I think, comes in not at the first order of causation. It's not that they don't like the Iranian women. By the way, I said before that nobody, I don't know anybody who's lost, frankly, for having voted against the constitutional amendments to end same-sex marriage. I mean that literally. I obviously follow it closely. Similarly, I don't know anybody who's lost because of his or her position on abortion. We do know some Republican Senate candidates who lost because of their absurdly anti-abortion position, legitimate rape, and God wants you to have the child. Democratic members of Congress are not afraid of gay and lesbian issues anymore, and they're not afraid of abortion. Those have not been the problems. Guns, as I said, is the exception. But there has been this problem with regard to a perception that we don't do enough to help with economic inequality. And the problem with our perceived advocacy on behalf of women and blacks and gays and other groups is it's a kind of a sibling jealousy. All you care about is them. It's not that they would, in the abstract, object. They're not anti-gay. They're not racist. They object to what they think is that the parents are spending it all on these kids and not on them. And what that means to me, what happens then is we get a vicious cycle. People who would like to see the government do more and are in fact angry because the government has not responded to them. I have a song in my head that illustrates it. I did find out that very few people under 40 have ever heard about it. That does not appear to be a substantial problem tonight. It's the old song, Winchester Cathedral. Winchester Cathedral, you're letting me down. You didn't do nothing when my baby left town. You could have done something. You didn't do nothing. That, I believe, encapsulates what a lot of working people say to the government. My economic status has eroded, and you could have done something, and you didn't do nothing. And the paradox then is, or the frustration is, that because they are angry, not at government in general, but because of the performance of the people they see as the pro-government party, even though we haven't been in power very much, they punish us, they punish the government by voting for people who don't believe in the government, who make it worse. They're angry that the government hasn't done more, so they vote for people who will see that the government does even less, and then they get even angrier, and they vote for even crazier people. And that came to a head with the TARP. And when I say this is the perception, bailouts. People hate bailouts. There were 5 bailouts in the 2008-2009 period, beginning in 2008, culminating in 2009. Maybe they began in 2007. If you ask people, they will tell you it's, the average citizen, the Democrats and their bailouts. That's one of the things that bothers me. Every one of those 5 bailouts was initiated by George W. Bush. Bear Stearns to J.P. Morgan Chase, the AIG bailout, the TARP, lending money to the banks, the automobiles, and the takeover of Fannie and Freddie with the money put in. Every single one by George Bush. 2 Bush started and finished. The administration did the Bear Stearns one, and they did the AIG one. By the way, I always have to mention this on AIG, if people want to know how bad things were and whose fault it was. AIG came to Ben Bernanke and Paulson in September of 2008 and said, we are $85 billion short of paying off the debts we've incurred by issuing credit default swaps, insuring people against the mortgage securities they paid. And Bernanke said, well, this is going to, after Lehman Brothers, we can't let that happen. So he advanced them $85 billion on his own under a power that we have severely restricted. They couldn't do that anymore thanks to our bill. But what's interesting is that a week later, when they were telling us how much they were going to need for the TARP, Paulson and Bernanke, who I think were very reasonable and responsible and serious men, who I was glad to work with, given that circumstance. I mean, I would tell you, this is the restraints of being in the legislature. If I was the Secretary of the Treasury, I might have designed something different. But when you're in the legislative body in the midst of a crisis, and you think that the people in power are responsible, either you go with them or you blow the place up. There is no way from the legislative situation that you can replace what they have the power basically to initiate. But Paulson said, oh, and he's counting up how much he needed, how he got to $700 billion. And he said, and $85 billion for AIG. Several of us said, no, you told us that. You're double counting that. The answer was no, that's an additional $85 billion for AIG. AIG not only did not have the money to pay its debts, it had no idea how much it owed. It was over $170 billion in debt. That has not stopped the founder of AIG, Mr. Greenberg, from suing the federal government because they treated him rudely when they advanced the company he had founded $185 billion, it turned out to be, to pay the debts, and he is suing for compensation. I believe I've said that this is a case of the arsonist suing the fire department for water damage, but it also shows why we had to get involved. It would not be possible for any company today to do that. But all 5 bailouts were the Republican initiation. The people blame us for them. So then the question is, how do you break this vicious cycle? I believe that much of what government does is, in fact, very popular. Some of my liberal friends have made the mistake of saying, okay, government's unpopular. We'll save the programs that we care about by separating ourselves from government. That doesn't work. I spoke at Google today, and I don't keep up with the latest technical advances, so I said to them, the notion that you can be critical of government but support these particular programs, I said, you cannot create a whole that is smaller than the sum of the parts and succeed. Actually, what I said to them was, at least, you didn't used to be able to do that physically. You guys may have figured out a way to do it. But I know it doesn't work politically. So when Bill Clinton, whom I greatly admired, said the era of big government is over, I think he made a terrible mistake. In the first place, this whole notion that big government is a bad thing, I make a point. We don't do enough to take on this notion and say, what do you mean government is bad? What part of government? Government is a collection of things. When people say to me, and I am very proud to have shrunk the government, my question is, okay, well, how many fewer firefighters do we have? How many fewer people are inspecting the food? To what extent are we letting the parks deteriorate? How many roads are in bad shape and bridges because you have smaller government? No, never let people, smaller government in particular can, and in fact, if you break it down, people say, yeah, they don't like smaller programs. And they have to be reminded that this is together, all together. I mean, the Department of Veterans Affairs is the best example. When we were trying to do healthcare, when we talked about single payer, the argument was socialized medicine. It was not socialized medicine. You know what's socialized medicine? The Department of Veterans Affairs. If you go into one of those very popular hospitals of the Department of Veterans Affairs, you drive onto a government parking lot, you enter a government building, and a government doctor tells a government nurse to stick a government needle in your ass. I mean, that is socialized medicine. And it's very popular. It got unpopular because it didn't have enough money, and the response was to give it more money even though it added to the deficit. I think the answer is in that. I believe if we could, in fact, find the resources to expand government programs that respond to the legitimate unhappiness of working class and middle class people, about their economic disadvantage and the fact that they have not been participating in prosperity, it would have a double benefit. It would be good in terms of what it accomplished, and you could begin to turn around their anger about government in general, and it would be a virtuous circle instead of a vicious circle. For example, many of the parents of these people, maybe some of the people themselves, got very good educations at state schools. That's no longer possible because of the drying up of government, because of the substantial reduction in the funding that's made available. Talk to any administrator of a state college or university or a community college. There are people here who do that. We've starved them so that it costs much more to go there. It should not be necessary for middle-income people to be so indebted to go there. We have construction workers who are unhappy. We have plenty of construction projects to do. We have a highway system started by that radical Dwight Eisenhower that is now in serious jeopardy of deterioration because the current Republicans don't want to fund it. Let's put more people to work there. We could do more publicly to absorb the health care costs. We could do more in terms of subsidizing health research through the tax system and justify bringing down the cost of prescription medicines. There are a number of things we can do short-term and long-term to make this a less unfair society, many of which would not retard growth, but help it. You do a better job of infrastructure, you're helping the economy. If you promote consumption, you are helping the economy. The question, though, is where do you get the money? Because with people so angry, what do you do? So I have, one of the things I have vowed never to do was to be one of those people who write a book and says, I have laid out the problem and now we must all think about how to solve it. Two proposals, very specific, both because I think they are good in themselves and because they give us the resources to, in fact, promote programs, implement programs that will deal with inequality. The first is a substantial reduction in America's overblown military budget, which comes by cutting back on America's worldwide obligations. In 2012, after the election, two people who had Bush administration affiliations when Obama was reelected wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. It's an op-ed Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal, the day after the 2012 election. And they said, we are worried about the Air Force. It is true that no American has been killed by hostile air power since 1953. They were writing in 2012. It is also true that the American Air Forces, because you know the Air Force is the largest air force in the world, but you do know what is the second largest air force in the world. It's the Navy, the U.S. Navy. On the theory that they will not soon go to war with each other, it would seem to me we could reduce at least one or the other. But they said, here's the problem. No American has been killed. We've totally dominated the skies over every battle, and therefore some people don't realize that we need to expand the Air Force. I had to confess, I was one of them. And they said, we must have the capacity to respond to trouble anywhere, anytime, any place. The big problem today is this notion that America has this responsibility to lead the world. That means beyond our national security interests. It means beyond humanitarian interventions. I'm very proud of what the American military was able to do with Liberia and Ebola. We have a very good record of helping to eradicate Ebola. But this notion that we must intervene in any trouble spot anywhere, and I read even the New York Times, there's a problem in Somalia. What's Obama doing about it? They have collapsed in this country. People are shooting each other in that country internally. What's Obama doing about it? Hopefully nothing, because there's nothing he can do. We have a wonderful military, and they are very good at what a military can do. A military can stop bad things from happening. I now think people ask me, what was my biggest mistake? George Bush was right, George H.W. Bush, to throw Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I was afraid he would do what his son did and march into Baghdad. Kuwait was a stable society, not a place I want to live. No problem, they didn't want me to live there either. But it was better when it was an autonomous country than when a brutal guy like Saddam Hussein tried to take it over. We expelled him from there, and we got out and left them to govern themselves. That made sense. But to go into Iraq, not just to get rid of Saddam Hussein, which I voted against, because he was a bad guy, but he was not causing any exterior harm, and then say, okay, but here's the deal. We're not going to leave until the Shia and Sunni get along. We're not going to leave until the Kurds are satisfied with the majority. We're not going to leave until we have helped create a coherent, functioning democracy. I wish we could, but you can't, and you certainly can't do it with guns. I don't think you can do it in Afghanistan. I think we should be clear, if there is a hostile power, an external power that attacks another country, we should go to their aid. But where you have a lack of coherence in a country, where you have internal fighting, you have to make a very exceptional case to me to intervene, maybe to prevent a genocide. Look, I was pleased that we overthrew Gaddafi, but the result has been pure hell for Libya. It has totally fallen apart, and we can't fix it. And there was this notion that America must get involved. Why are we doing this? Well, the default position is that we have to lead the world. Why? Who said so? In whose interest is it? And most importantly, the world doesn't want to be led, and we can't lead people who don't want to lead. By the way, another argument, very practical, about the need to expand. One of the arguments is we have to expand the Navy. Why do we have to expand the Navy? We have overwhelming naval power pretty much. Well, because we have to make sure that everywhere in the world we keep open the lanes for shipping. Why is it our responsibility to do that? As a matter of fact, who threatens the shipping lanes? There's only one potential threat, China. Now, the shipping lanes that we are told we have to keep open, that's where trade goes back and forth across the Pacific. What happens over those shipping lanes? China makes an enormous amount of money. China has as much incentive to tear up the ship, to close down the shipping lanes, as Pizza Hut has to tear up the streets. That's how they make their money. Yeah, we should be very powerful, but it goes beyond anything rational. And here's what I think is the explanation. America was not very militarily active before 1940. We intervened in World War I, we came back out. We were protected by the oceans. And then we had to gear up for Hitler because he was a vicious beast who threatened us, who did have the capacity to threaten our existence as a free society. And when he was defeated, you had Stalin, morally no better, and also heavily armed. While Russia was as devastated by World War II as the other countries, because of the brutality of his dictatorship, he could put everything he did have into a military. So you had a desperately poor country with a very rich military. And for a period, we did have in the Soviet Union another potential threat to our existence as a free society. That was already declining by the 80s. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, we were back to 1940. That is, we were in a world in which there was no existential threat to America. And in recognition of that, even though there was this leadership thing, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton both began to decrease our military. In fact, when Leon Panetta became Secretary of Defense, he said, we cannot make the mistake we've always made that when a war is over, when a threat is over, we downsize our military too much. I pointed out that one of the examples he gave, he said, we did that after World War II and after Korea and after Vietnam, and we did it after the end of the Cold War. I was able to point out with some glee that right after the Cold War, which is 91, 92, 93, when Leon Panetta regretted that we had downsized the military, Bill Clinton's budget director was Leon Panetta. And I asked him why he had therefore unduly downsized the military, and he never answered me. The fact is, I cannot think of a time when there was an objective that we had good reason to achieve, and we were unable to do it because we didn't have the military power. There was one strain on the military. It was when George Bush, foolishly and unwisely, having invaded Afghanistan, which I voted for, then went into Iraq. And there was a period there was a constraint. But even that was overcome. Our failures, our inability to succeed in Afghanistan and Iraq has nothing to do with the lack of military power. It has to do with the lack of the cohesion in those societies, and we cannot fix that from the outside, and certainly not with weaponry. But here's what happened. The threat of communism recedes. And those people who want America to be the dominant power in the world because we had to be the leaders, there are various arguments for it. Some quite sincerely believe that it is God's wish that America be the leader in the world. God has ordained us. Not being a theologian, I then do wonder, though, if God has ordained America to be the leader, who did he put in charge before, like, 1800? Was nobody the leader? Was it? But the fact is that they really needed, they knew that that wasn't going to sell. They also understand that if they're going to maintain that level of military spending, they've got to scare the American people into it. So they achieved something very impressive, although I deeply regretted it, with Dick Cheney in the lead. We were attacked by that murderer, Osama bin Laden, and he killed thousands of innocent people. And the terrorists are brutal and terrible and nowhere near a threat to our existence as a society. They are a threat to the safety to some extent, but they do not come close to what we faced under the Soviet leadership, under the Stalin, even Khrushchev, or under Hitler. But Cheney and his allies, with Bush giving them passive support, managed to elevate the threat of terrorism to the level of existential threat represented by communism and Nazism, and pumped up the military. And I think the American people are ready now to say, no, that's not the case. In fact, it was already starting to decline. Obama had support for pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And then came the Islamic State butchers, terrible people who also had that bad effect. But I think people are running out of that. Give you an example of what I think even the hawks know is the case. Obama, to his credit, asked Congress for authorization to pursue the Islamic State. Not enough, but at least, unlike most presidents, he said, okay, let's do this together. The Republicans have said they do not like Obama's proposal because it is too restrained. It says no extensive use of ground troops, and it's for 3 years. And they want a much more expansive authorization to get involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, and almost certainly Syria, and maybe a little war with Iran on the side, and not so much on the side. And what they say is, well, we can't get any legislation done because we don't like the president's plan. Well, why can't they do their own? The Republicans know how to legislate. The Republicans do not like the restraint in the president's plan, but they're politically afraid to do what they want to do because they know it would be unpopular. They want him to take the responsibility for making war because they know the American people don't want to. We could cut back and free up well over $100 billion a year and be very safe. The other area that takes care of the federal government, there is a crisis at the state level. State universities have been severely depleted so we could fund prisons. And people said, well, let's do both. I've been told, well, we just got to be more efficient. After all, why should it cost more to send someone to prison than to send them to the state university? There's a very simple answer. Very few people try to escape from the state university, and that's very expensive. But we have people in prison who should be there. I think people who are violent towards each other, people who attack other people, yeah, I want them locked up for some period. But many of the people in prison are there because they have ingested recreational drugs of which we as a society morally disapprove. That is a great error. It's a great injustice. The war on poverty, the Republicans like to criticize, the war on poverty has been a much more successful effort than the war on drugs, which has been a dismal failure by every count, and it costs a lot of money. The rule ought to be that we will not make it illegal for you to ingest any substance unless it is going to produce an immediate medical emergency, which the rest of us have to deal with, or it makes you likelier to damage other people. In other words, if people think it's not good to take marijuana, fine, tell people that. Have treatment centers, but you don't make it illegal. You make it illegal if they're going to ingest something that's going to cause them to be a danger to others, with one exception, because it is too late to outlaw alcohol again, which is, of course, the one substance in our society that is most responsible for causing people to damage others. But we should say, if you want to, and it's hypocrisy. Part of it is, it's a part of racism. One of the problems in New York, stop and frisk, et cetera, was marijuana law enforcement is disproportionately against racial minorities. Cocaine is another great hypocrisy. I know there are people here who know high-achieving people who use cocaine. That's one of the great hypocrisies in our society. I do remember I love show business stories. Tallulah Bankhead stories are among my favorites. And there was apparently the time when Tallulah was in a nightclub and took out her eye drops and put them in and ran screaming to the bathroom because she had mistakenly taken out her cocaine. Everybody knew that she used cocaine. And in fact, if people want to use cocaine, that's their decision. People do not commit violent crimes because they are taking heroin or injecting heroin. They commit violent crimes because our law inclines them to steal money and rob people so they can take heroin. We would save tens of billions of dollars by saying you have the cops, and then you have the judicial system, and you have the prisons. If we could reduce American military spending to where we were by far the strongest nation in the world, but not by such enormous multiples against any possible enemy, and stop locking people up and prosecuting them for the recreational use of drugs, we would free up resources, which I believe it would then be popular to reduce the cost of higher education, to increase our infrastructure, to bring down the cost of public transportation so it would be safe and sound, so working people who have to use it would feel better about it, to subsidize health research more so we could bring down the cost of prescription drugs, to do more in terms of picking up some health care costs generally, to stop threatening that we're going to have to cut the cost of living increase for people living on $2,000 a month in downtown Boston, which is on the table. So that's my view, that the problem, I do not feel guilty as a gay man who has been pushing to be treated equally for the fact that a lot of white guys don't vote Democratic anymore. Not my fault. It is the fault of those who have stood in the way of economic equality. And there was one last one. This doesn't even cost money, but it's been a consequence. And I think this one people are starting to wake up to. Liberals for too long, partly for cultural reasons, intellectuals, etc., did not fully appreciate the essential role that unions play in providing some protection for working class people. There is a causal relationship, not just a statistical correlation, between the weakening of unions, both public and private, and the decrease in inequality. And we need to do better about that. I'm ready for questions. Come to the microphone.
Hi, sir. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for being here. As both a member of the Harvard College Democrats and a member of the team writing the policy for the youth homeless shelter, which hopefully the members of this congregation will vote to have in the basement of this church, I really wanted to thank you for being here. I basically wanted to know if you agreed with, I guess, my assessment of the shift in both policy focus and rhetoric of American politics from the Great Society, which I know you begin your book with, to now from a focus on lifting the floor, focusing on the people at the very bottom of the economic structure, the people, for example, who would be served by the homeless shelter that would be here, with programs like Medicaid, even things like that the Department of Housing and Urban Development would deal with, to a focus, like I said, both in rhetoric and policy, to focus to sustaining the middle class, which I absolutely think is important. But I'd wonder, both of you agree with that, and if you do, why you think the rhetoric has shifted to exclude basically the people who rest at the very bottom.
I think what you have on the Democratic side is not a move away from trying to help people at the lower end, but frankly, doing it while talking about it less. That is, and I do not think that those two are at all contradictory. As a matter of fact, I am absolutely certain. If we are to maintain the political support necessary to get people into office and to have the revenue to deal with homelessness, to deal with Medicaid, then we have to get a broader coalition. A program focused only on the poor is going to run to the problem that I mentioned before, that working and middle class people, I never said just middle class, working class people will resent it. I think we need to tie the two together. And I think that it is a mistake to talk only about one or the other. By the way, I'm glad you're here, the Young Democrats. Let me say, I have said that with all the advances we've made in LGBT issues, I am still a member of a group that is not given sufficient respect and appreciation. I am a partisan Democrat. And partisanship is essential to a democracy. The excessive hyper-partisanship of the Tea Party has unfortunately lapped over and discredited it. You do not have rational politics without political parties that are well run. The Founding Fathers hated political parties while they were forming them. So I respect young people who are responsible members of political parties. Yes, sir.
So the hope is that we have government programs that help the middle class, and that restores their faith in government.
And the working class. Why only middle class? I talked about working class.
Middle class and down. And in that context, something odd happened in Kentucky, which is that Obamacare was implemented through a state exchange called Connect. It was enormously popular, And yet, in the recent Senate election, the candidate was running straight away from Obama because the association with, and not refusing to call the program Obamacare because the association was seen as toxic, meaning that the Democrats had this huge policy success and were somehow politically unable to take credit for it.
Right.
How did that happen?
It happens everywhere in the country because of exactly what I said. There is this disconnect where people are, in fact, supportive in some cases of particular programs, but are against government in general and punish the party of government. With regard to the health care bill, the problem is when it was passed, and this was the problem that Bill Clinton faced too, if either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama had a pot of money, $50, $60 billion, that they could have put into health care, it would have been much more popular because the perception was, not the reality, but the perception was that Obama, as Clinton tried, were extending health care to poor people at the expense of those who already had it. And that perception stuck from the beginning, and it was hard to get rid of. Now, I think we were making real progress, frankly, in undoing that prejudice. And then the one thing for which I have to blame the administration, that disastrous rollout. If you look, people were starting to be positive. And then you had the disastrous rollout, which once again made people who were not directly involved think ill of it. But Kentucky is a good example where people, even if they benefit from the specifics, are convinced that government in general is bad, and that's the frame we have to approach.
Hi, my name is Ben Bolger, and I'm very curious what you think about the problem of gerrymandering. It seems that it is getting worse and worse, and the lack of competitive elections seems to be making Congress more and more radical, and there's less common ground. What do you think can be done to make more competitive elections?
Gerrymandering is not getting worse, but it is a problem. Secondly, do understand, gerrymandering is a problem in the House. You cannot blame what goes on in the United States Senate on gerrymandering, since you have two senators per state and you can't change it. The other thing I would say is this, well, gerrymandering is part of it. By the way, we're in Massachusetts. The governor was Gary, Elbridge Gerry. We have to, we don't pronounce a lot right here, but we can at least do that one. But the issue is, it is less gerrymandering, that is a contributing factor, than the devolution of media in America to the point where the most active people live in two parallel media universes. Very few people watch the same source anymore. The left is listening to MSNBC, and they're on the Huffington Post, et cetera, and the right is on Fox News and these talk show hosts. And here's the problem. It is not simply that people hear only from people they agree with. That leads people who are the most engaged to think that their views are the majority when they may not be. So that when an elected official tries to do the best we can, and we said we didn't have the votes to do single payer, which I want to do, we're told, oh yeah, how can you not have the votes? Everybody I know is for it. And so that contributes to it. As to the problem of gerrymandering, there's discouraging news that isn't getting enough attention. The U.S. Supreme Court may be at it again, of ruining our political system or damaging it. Some states have begun a system of commissions that do redistricting. They had one in California. They were trying to do one in Florida, which do it in a nonpartisan way. And in Arizona, where they got the votes for such a commission in a referendum, the legislature has now announced that this violates the Constitution, which unfortunately very specifically says the manner of choosing members of Congress shall be decided by the state legislatures. And the Supreme Court appears ready to say that. So the one alternative to excessive partisan gerrymandering, which I agree with you is a problem, which is to put it into the hands of a commission, is not going to work unless the legislature agrees to do it, and that means giving up power they're less likely to do. So there was an out, but it looks like we're going to lose it. Yes, sir.
Congressman, I'm a Republican lifelong who voted for Obama twice. Hearing your views tonight, is there some way we could clone you into some man about 20 years younger who could survive 2 terms as President of the United States?
That's very flattering. You illustrate our problem. When I got to the legislature in 1972, many of my close allies were Republicans. People here will remember Frank Hatch. I tried in 2010, when I was under the gun from the right wing, to put together a group of Republicans for Frank. And I called a number of the Republicans I'd worked with when I was in the legislature, and in politics, and they all said, "Oh, I can't join." I said, "Why? I thought you liked me." They said, "We do. We're not Republicans anymore." They were driven out of that party. Former State Senator Bill Saltonstall repudiated that party before he died. Frank Hatch, the Republican gubernatorial nominee in '78, left the Republican Party. In the '90s, when the Republicans took over after '95, and they tried to weaken a very good amendment that Ed Brooke had sponsored to limit the amount that rent that could be charged to lower income people. It was called the Brooke Amendment. And they tried to weaken it. And I called him. I said, "Ed, what are we going to do? You know, can you give me some help?" He said, "Barney, that's not my party anymore. I can't do any good." So I regret the fact that the Republicans have moved away in that direction.
Now, I'd like to ask the questions that I wanted to ask before I heard your speech tonight. I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I did go through the index, and there were 2 items in there that I missed. One was Glass-Steagall. 2 was Benghazi Bill O'Reilly. I saw your 5 minutes with him last week. As you said, you got 1 minute, he got 4. And I saw the appendix in your book tonight. Did you get him to read those appendix before he interviewed you last week?
No, but he clearly had, so he stayed away from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Great myth. I would say this about, I didn't mention O'Reilly because he's not
worth it.
important. As to Glass-Steagall, I didn't mention it because I voted against the repeal of Glass-Steagall, but not because I thought it should stay in power, but because it should have been replaced. It was passed 80 years ago. And Elizabeth Warren is for Glass-Steagall because she wants the banks to be smaller. She will tell you that it had no role in the crisis. I mentioned the derivatives of AIG. Glass-Steagall did not outlaw that derivative manipulation because it didn't exist when they were there. The biggest single problem was banks making loans which they then sold to other people in securities, so they no longer had to worry about whether the loan was repaid. That would have been totally legal under Glass-Steagall. So I do think there's reasons to restrict the banks, but Glass-Steagall was passed in 1933. I think it's time, and that's what we try to do, is to do a new, more relevant set of restrictions.
As a former community banker, my concern was that the investment bankers were going to take over the reserves, the insurance companies, and the commercial banks.
Yeah, well,
turns out the commercial banks took over the investment banks.
And we did take over.
Change the industry.
We did pass the Volcker Rule and other things that restrict them. Yes, sir.
Yes. In the last few elections, I've noticed it's much easier to get people outraged about someone much poorer than getting $100 for doing nothing than a rich person getting $10 million for doing nothing. Why do you think this is, and what do you think can be done about it?
Well, I try to address that, frankly. If I wasn't able to get that point across in my speech, it is that the people in the middle class and working class believe that we are not doing anything to help them because we are so interested in helping the poor people. They feel abandoned, and that's why they're angry at us.
Yeah, and about the rich people, why don't they get outraged?
They do. They are outraged, but they still vote for people who are more supportive. Part of it is that, remember, America is the one country that's never had a socialist tradition. There is this lingering kind of Horatio Alger thing, but it is more visible to them to see the poor people. But I'd say they're not motivated mostly by any welfare or by any, they're motivated by our failure to live to what they think is our responsibility to help them out. Yeah.
Hi. I've got a question about foreign, not domestic policy. Last fall, I spent about a week and a half in the West Bank of Palestine and saw firsthand the horrible conditions that the Palestinians are living under, with horrible discrimination and poverty. And I'm just wondering what your take is on that situation there.
Well, I was very disappointed when Netanyahu said what he said. I will say, historically, the fact that we have not had a two-state solution is as much the fault of the Palestinians, in some cases more. I believe that under Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Ehud Olmert, the conservative Prime Minister of Israel, the Palestinians were offered a pretty good deal that would have resulted in some two-state solution and their own being in power. And they rejected it because there was a unwillingness in the Arab world to accept the existence of Israel. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu made a terrible substantive and political mistake, in part because no one will ever again blame the Palestinians, even if it's their fault that we don't get the solution. And I think what the president is doing is correct. And I think what we need to do now is to make a very important distinction between Netanyahu and the state of Israel. I remain very supportive and admiring of much of the state of Israel. If you look at freedom of speech and LGBT rights, treatment of women, freedom of religion, Israel is the only country that comes close. But there is this flaw if they are not prepared to extend those rights in a separate country. And I think what President Obama is doing is absolutely right, distinguishing between America's support for Israel, as it has been. People should understand what Netanyahu did was to repudiate every prime minister, Ariel Sharon, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, as well as the Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. So I think what the president is now doing is right, and I think it is in Israel's interest. When you have a friend who is doing things that damage himself, I think it's your obligation to tell him. And I think American Jews and other supporters of Israel ought to be thankful that President Obama is trying to restrain Netanyahu from his own excesses and errors. Yes, sir.
So the internet and social media, cell phones, they've enabled in a lot of other parts of life have enabled people to have kind of instantaneous connection with each other. In your experience in government, do you see ways that that kind of instantaneous connection, that intense connectivity, can benefit government? That you can bring people in some way? No,
it is more likely. It is more likely to be harmful for this reason. I went to Washington. I told people what I thought about issues. I worked very hard at them. I assembled the staff. When it came down to decisions, there was no way people hundreds of miles away could have told me what was the right thing to do, even given their own values. They didn't know the problems. They didn't know the constraints. The other thing is this. Do you believe that the use of social media is demographically neutral? No. Therefore, if you empower social media, you are taking some anti-democratic steps.
I'd like to ask a question closer to home about the Olympics coming to Boston. And what I see is with the commission, I'm worried about the gentrification of Boston in general, with the tall towers, et cetera, and some of the overlapping people on 2024 and the developers and architects of our new Boston. And I wondered if you had any comments.
Yeah, well, two things. First of all, I think the city should be very tough. I know Mayor Walsh talks about doing this, on insisting that a percentage of any new construction be for lower and moderate income people. In fact, my major policy issue before I get into the banking stuff, in addition to LGBT and trying to cut the military, was to try to provide funds for good, decent, affordable rental housing. I've always been skeptical of putting poor people in homes they can't maintain, and we've had some successes there. As to the Olympics, I guess I was quoted, being interviewed by Boston Magazine. When I'm in town, I live with my sister in Newtonville, and I was there during a time when the snow was so high, we had to alternate putting our cars in, and the guy said, "What about the Olympics?" And my frankly spontaneous response was, "Look, we're pretty crowded and small here. We haven't even got room for the snow, and the Olympics is bigger than snow." And I think it would be a disaster, not just for Boston. I debate on a regular basis on CNBC with a very civil conservative named Larry Kudlow. And we came into agreement on one issue, namely, we want to write a joint article objecting to municipalities or counties or states subsidizing sports stadiums, using public money to do that. And I put the Olympics in that category. I think it would be a very bad idea.
I agree. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Oh, hi there. I had, it's an odd thing to have done, but I and a couple of other people audited the 2010 election in South Carolina. And one of the things we found was a lot of votes don't get counted. And I thought, oh, well, you just go tell the legislators. They'll be unhappy because they work hard for those votes and they're not getting them. And I talked to the people I was working with in South Carolina, and they're like, they're just not going to be that interested. So you're a legislator. You ran a lot. Why aren't legislators? I mean, a lot of votes don't get counted. It's more like a personal question. How do you feel about that?
Against it, do you think I was in favor of this? Do you not?
No, I don't think you're in favor.
Whose votes do you think weren't getting counted?
Everybody's. A few votes every election. You go out and work hard for your votes. People go out and vote for you, and then they go through the jurisdictions where they're counted, and few of them get lost.
With any purpose or just randomly?
Just by random.
Well, I can't comment on the efficiency of South Carolina elections. That's not common. Most elections these days are run fairly well. We've done better supervising. There has been a problem, and we need to pay election day workers more. You've been to votes, and you go there, and it's been too often some 82-year-old who's getting a cup of coffee, a donut, and $5 to sit there for 13 hours. Not a good way to recruit a workforce. So we are trying to make that better. I am not aware of that as a general problem. I don't think it's a problem in Massachusetts. The total votes tallied up generally are...
It's pretty close, but it's...
Well, I don't know what specific problems there were in South Carolina and can't comment on them.
Okay, no, I get that. It's just the legislators...
No, you apparently don't, because you're asking me, what do you want me to do? I can't do anything about South Carolina.
I'm not asking you about doing anything about South Carolina. It's a general problem. That
I said it's not a general problem. I am not aware of it in Massachusetts. I think our totals are pretty near exact in terms of the people. They tally the votes cast, and they count the ones that were there.
Okay, that's fine.
Hello. I was just wondering what one bill from your time, either in Congress or in the Massachusetts legislature, do you most wish could have passed that didn't? Passed and signed?
Well, the policy I would most like to have achieved, it wasn't in just one bill, was to reduce military spending. In terms of a bill, I will now say it was a bill that would have made it easier for people to join unions, because I believe the obstacle to collective bargaining that we now see, a conscious policy by the Republicans, is causing serious, it's a major cause, a contributor to the economic inequality. Let me just take a minute to give you an example of what I mean. And by the way, one of the things we need to do is to resist having more and more done at the state level, because the conservatives have a two-step. They have things done at the state level, then in each state they say, oh, we can't do that because we'll lose jobs to other states. The Volkswagen opened up a plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The union, UAW, said, we want to organize it. Volkswagen said, fine, we get along fine with unions in Germany. Let's have an election as American law requires. It was clearly going to go in favor of the UAW, and Senator Robert Corker, a supposed mainstream, reasonable conservative, led the Tennessee Republicans in threatening Volkswagen and its workers. And they said, you know that money we were going to give you, that public money we were going to make available to you to expand the plant? If you have a union, you can't have it. And people said to Corker, wait a minute, this is the company and they want the union. Why do you care? And he said, very relevant, you ask about economic inequality. If Volkswagen has a union, the union will succeed in raising wages at that plant. And if wages go up at the Volkswagen plant, that will have an upward pressure on wages throughout Tennessee. And if wages throughout Tennessee go up, we will lose our ability to lure industry from other states. So that's what I'm talking about, conscious policy. You can go look that one up. That's clear. Yes, sir.
Mr. Frank, I volunteered in your office as an intern in 2008, and this is leading into a question. Around 2008, like Twitter was just starting to take off, and I remember I would see you in your office. You had no time for any kind of social media.
That was in the middle of the beginning of the financial crisis.
Yeah, it was a very busy time, but there were other people, like congressmen that you were working with, who would talk to you and then go back to Twitter and say something rude, and that would get all of the buzz. And I'm in agreement with what you were saying earlier, that this does seem to, social media does seem to reward like arrogance and misplaced pride, but that seemes to be informing our political conversations recently. That these are the loudest voices, and they get the most talk.
I agree. I remain unconvinced. You may be able to tell that from my answers, but if I had to tweet any of my answers, I would not have been able to say anything I wanted. I also, and I do not think that the Hillary Clinton email will have any political effect. I think it's inside baseball, unless something comes out that was very rude and embarrassing, and I don't expect that to happen. But I do have this question for her. Who the hell can read 50,000 emails? And why are you sending emails when you should be talking to people? I went to work in the city of Boston in 1967, partly through the auspices of our friend Chris Lydon, who joins us here, who is one of the matchmakers between me and Kevin White. I think it's the statute of limitations has lapsed on our being able to note that. And one of the things I literally was told, it was something that was first articulated by Martin Lomasny around 1910. Kid, you never write when you can talk, You never talk when you can nod, and you never nod when you can wink. And you will never find an email from me that was embarrassing. I think emails are very good for the one-way transmission of information. The meeting is at 11. I cannot come. Once you start getting into negotiations, I don't want that. Yes, sir.
Mr. Frank, this is Jeremy, and here's our last question tonight.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you.
Right. Oh, sure, Mr. Frank. So, first of all, climate change, or fighting it, is a very important issue for me. And earlier in your speech, you talked about economic imperatives and social imperatives, and how economic is very important to most people, money, living. So I firmly believe that climate change is totally a negative, it'll be negative economically for everybody. So why doesn't everybody believe in fighting climate change if it's so financial?
First of all, I'm serious. Have you ever talked to anybody who's opposed to doing anything about climate change?
Yeah, I have. Well,
what do they tell you?
They tell me, Jeremy, it doesn't exist, man.
All right,
That's all.
Your answer.
All right.
First of all, people see things from an ideology. And by the way, I didn't mention climate change because it is not one of the things that we have to do for working class and middle class people. And by the way, as we approach climate change, we have to be sensitive that there's a tension there. Fighting climate change is the highest priority, but we have to pay some attention to the near-term effects and provide some compensation for people. And if we don't get that kind of support for liberals, we won't get it. I mean, if the Republicans win the presidency in 2016, what little we've been able to do to combat climate change will come to a halt. Some people are against it because they make money by changing the climate, and people tend to be very attached to that. Others because they have this ideological view that government's a bad thing, and it is frustrating. On the whole, most people say they're for it, but here's the other problem. At any given moment, when you're making a policy choice, the Keystone pipeline, or coal mining, or anything else like that, there is a broad public that wants you to stop climate change. They got a lot of other things on their mind. There's a much narrower but much more intense public that's going to lose money if you do it. And the way our political system works, they are more likely to talk to the members of the Congress than not. So the important thing is for people to write to their legislators, tell their senators and representatives, I care a lot about this. And it's also, as typified by the fact that you're here, people say to me, what can we do to get young people? And I said, well, climate change is a very important one. I mean, look, climate change is not so much a problem for me, because I won't be here. But on the other hand, it is one of the adequate financing, the chance to get a higher education without indebting yourself, and climate change are the two issues we should be going at over and over again with young people. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The classic case is 9/11. Right? The Red Cross received many millions of dollars to help the victims of 9/11, but essentially most of the victims of 9/11 were dead. So, it could help some of the families, but it ended up so much money that actually the president of Red Cross at first said, well, they were going to hold some of this in reserve for other tragedies. And then she got howled down and had to backtrack. I think even eventually maybe resigned, if I remember it rightly.